It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. I had found the rental online, a secluded house nestled in the forests of a small coastal town. The pictures showed a cozy little place with a quaint porch, large windows that looked out to the trees, and an interior that was a mix of rustic charm and modern comforts. It felt almost too good to be true. I was looking forward to some quiet time, just me, my books, and the smell of fresh pine. The journey started smoothly. The drive from the city was long, but as the scenery turned from highways to winding forest roads, I could feel the weight of stress lifting. By the time I pulled up to the house, it was late afternoon, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. The house looked exactly as it had in the pictures, small but welcoming. But even in that first moment, there was something about it that felt off. Maybe it was just the quiet, or the way the trees crowded close around the property, casting everything in a dim green light. I brushed it off as nerves and unloaded my things. Once inside, I found everything in order, yet the house had an oddly oppressive atmosphere. The furniture was well kept, but there was a feeling of stillness, almost like the house hadn't been touched in years. I noticed small details that seemed out of place. A layer of dust in the corners, strange, faint stains on the floor by the couch. It was probably nothing. Maybe the cleaning crew had just overlooked a few spots. I settled in, prepared a quick meal, and went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. That first night was when things started to feel wrong. I had barely fallen asleep when I heard the first sound. It was soft at first, a faint scratching noise coming from somewhere downstairs. I convinced myself it was the branches brushing against the windows. But as I lay there staring into the darkness, I realized it wasn't just the trees. The noise had a rhythm, like something deliberate ... tapping, a scraping that seemed to be moving through the house, getting closer to the stairs. I lay there tense, listening as the sound grew louder. I felt frozen, my body locked in a strange, heavy dread. But after a few minutes, it stopped. Silence filled the house again. I didn't move for what felt like hours, finally falling into a restless sleep. The next morning, I chalked it up to an overactive imagination. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the strange unease that had settled in my chest. But when I returned to the house that evening, something had changed. As I entered, I felt as if I were walking into someone else's space, a place I didn't belong. The air was colder, heavy with an odd, stale smell, and the quiet was more intense than before. That night, the sound started up again, louder this time. The scratching, that eerie tapping, like something or someone was walking through the house. And this time it was followed by something even stranger. The sounds didn't just stay downstairs, they seemed to creep up the stairs, pausing just outside my door. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to hear, wondering if it was some animal that had gotten in. And then I heard it, a sigh, faint but unmistakable, like it was inches away from me, just beyond the door. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run out of the house. But I didn't. I was scared to move, scared to draw attention to myself. So I stayed in bed, eyes fixed on the door, my body tense, waiting. The noises stopped again, just as suddenly as they'd started. By morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I was tired, but more than that, I was nervous. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I couldn't deny the dread growing inside me. I spent the day out, lingering in town, grabbing lunch, anything to avoid going back to the house too early. That evening, as I returned, I found the door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. Had I forgotten to lock it? I was certain I had. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, every nerve in my body on high alert. Nothing seemed out of place, but there was a strange sense of something lingering, watching. I could feel it in every room. The final night was the worst. I barely slept, kept awake by that suffocating feeling, as if the walls were closing in. I lay in bed, the silence pressing down on me, waiting, almost daring the noises to start. But there was nothing, just the quiet, stretching on until I could barely stand it. I must have drifted off because suddenly I awoke to the sound of a faint rustling. I forced myself to sit up. and that's when I saw a figure in the hallway. Not clear, but a dark shape, just barely visible in the shadows. My heart pounded as I watched it stand there, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, but I knew what I had seen. My skin crawled as I realized I wasn't alone. I don't remember how I got through that night, but as soon as morning light started to filter through the windows, I grabbed my things and left, barely pausing to shut the door behind me. I drove away, feeling that sense of dread fade with every mile. But even now, thinking about that house, I can still feel it, the weight of those nights, the creeping sense that something was there, hidden just beyond the edge of my vision. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the property, found a few local articles about it. Turns out the house had a history. The previous owner had died there under mysterious circumstances, alone and undiscovered for weeks. Since then, people had reported strange noises, whispers, shadows in the hallways. It seemed ridiculous, something out of a horror story. But I knew what I had felt in that house. And as I sit here now, telling you this, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was there still waiting for its next visitor. Story 2. I found the listing for the rental on a site I'd never used before, but it seemed reputable enough. The house was in a quiet area, described as a small lakeside cabin, isolated but beautiful, surrounded by pine trees with a deck overlooking the water. It had a clean, modern interior and just enough charm to feel like a real escape. It was cheaper than most places, and that made me a little suspicious. But I shrugged it off and booked it for the weekend, excited for the solitude. The drive was straightforward, but took me deep into unfamiliar woods, where the road narrowed and cell service disappeared. By the time I reached the cabin, it was nearing dusk, with a thick fog rolling over the lake and casting a heavy silence over the area. The place looked just as advertised, quaint but well kept, painted white with big windows facing the lake. Everything seemed fine, except for a strange feeling I got as I stepped onto the porch. A chill hit me, a sudden unease I couldn't explain. But I brushed it off as travel nerves and went inside. Inside, the cabin was meticulously clean, almost too clean, with a strange, sterile smell that didn't quite fit the rustic vibe. It had all the comforts: plush couches, a cozy fireplace, shelves filled with books, and a kitchen stocked with essentials. It seemed perfect. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed a bizarre pattern of small things that seemed off. For one, I felt as if someone else had been here recently, though I was supposedly the only one with the key. The fireplace looked like it had recently been used, with faint soot marks on the hearth, and the air had a lingering, faint odor that I couldn't quite place. Night fell quickly, and I started to feel anxious. It was the little things, really. The way the cabin felt slightly too quiet, the eerie stillness outside. I forced myself to relax, reading a book by the fireplace until I started to feel drowsy. I got ready for bed, checking the doors and windows before heading upstairs to the small bedroom. The bed was warm and comfortable, and for a moment I thought I might finally shake the strange feeling and get some rest. But then, as I lay there, I heard a faint creaking noise coming from downstairs, like a footstep across the wooden floor. I held my breath, waiting, listening. Maybe it was the old house settling, or maybe I'd imagined it. But the creaks continued, slow and deliberate, like someone walking through the living room. I told myself it had to be the house or an animal outside, but every part of me felt tense, like something was wrong. The creaking stopped, and silence filled the cabin again. I lay there, stiff with fear, barely daring to breathe, straining to hear any other sound. But eventually I must have drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark outside, the kind of pitch black that makes it impossible to see even a foot in front of you. I felt groggy, like I hadn't slept at all, and I was freezing. I reached for the bedside lamp, but it didn't turn on. Power outage, I figured, trying to ignore the creeping unease that was building inside me. As I lay there, waiting for my eyes to adjust, I became aware of a faint, rhythmic noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a slow, methodical scrape along the floor, almost as if someone were dragging something heavy across the wood. My chest tightened as I listened. fear blooming in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to get up and check, but something about that sound kept me rooted in place. After what felt like hours, the scratching stopped. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and abandoning this strange place in the dead of night, but I told myself that I was being ridiculous. Morning would come soon, and everything would make sense in the daylight. So I stayed in bed, my eyes locked on the door, half expecting it to open any moment. But it never did. When dawn finally broke, I got up, feeling exhausted but relieved to see the soft gray light filling the cabin. As I walked downstairs, the strange smell hit me again, stronger this time, a mix of something stale and slightly metallic. I searched the cabin, checking every room, every corner, but found nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I left for a few hours, trying to clear my head, wandering the nearby town and avoiding the thought of returning to that cabin. But I knew I had to go back to pack up. I resolved to leave a day early, the idea of spending another night there impossible. When I got back, the cabin felt different. There was an odd warmth to the air, almost like someone had been inside and lit a fire. But I hadn't used the fireplace since I'd arrived. I hurried to pack my things, tossing everything into my bag with nervous, rushed movements. As I made my way to the front door, a framed picture on the wall caught my eye. It was small, faded with age, showing a family standing in front of what looked like the same cabin. But something about the image felt wrong, the way their faces looked blurred, as if they'd been scratched over. Curious and a little horrified, I leaned in closer. And that's when I noticed something even stranger. There was a mirror behind the family in the picture, and in the reflection, I could just make out a shadowy figure standing off to the side, almost hidden in the darkness. My stomach churned as I realized the figure looked almost identical to the dark shape I'd seen in the hallway mirror when I first arrived, a figure I'd brushed off as my own reflection in bad lighting. I grabbed my bag, practically sprinting out of the cabin, and to my car, my heart racing as I pulled away from the house, never once looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I started to feel the grip of fear loosen. Later, I did some research, learning more about the cabin's history. Apparently, years ago, it had been owned by a family who vanished without a trace. People in town said that the cabin had been empty for years after, but visitors who stayed there reported strange experiences, sounds at night, the feeling of being watched, even the sight of shadows moving just beyond their line of vision. They called it the echo of presence that lingered in the house, something that refused to let go. I don't know what I saw, or who, or what was there with me that night, but whatever it was, it's still there, watching, waiting, echoing through that cabin in the woods. And I can't help but wonder, did I leave it behind, or is it something I'll carry with me, echoing in every shadowed room I enter? Story 3. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, a chance to unwind, recharge, and leave the noise of the city behind. I found the listing on a lesser-known rental site, a cabin nestled deep in the mountains, advertised as the perfect escape for nature lovers. It looked rustic but charming, and the reviews were overwhelmingly positive. Everyone praised the beauty, the tranquility, the solitude. It sounded like just what I needed. The drive up was beautiful but isolated, a narrow winding road leading through dense forests and stretching into the hills. As I got closer, cell service faded, and by the time I reached the cabin, it was gone entirely. That was the first thing that felt off. I hadn't expected total isolation, but I shrugged it off as part of the escape experience. The cabin was small but well kept, perched at the edge of a steep hill overlooking the valley below. The forest surrounded it on all sides, thick and dark, with trails branching off from the back of the property and disappearing into the trees. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, large windows with wooden frames, furniture that looked hand-carved, and small, personal touches that made it feel almost like someone's home. But as I unloaded my things, I felt a creeping sense of unease, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. I chalked it up to nerves. I wasn't used to being this alone, surrounded by miles of forest in every direction. The first night passed uneventfully. I settled in, read by the fire, and went to bed early, lulled to sleep by the sound of wind rustling through the trees. But as I lay there in the dark, I became aware of a different sound, quiet, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal or maybe branches scraping against the cabin, but the sound was too deliberate, like a faint tapping or shuffling, as if someone were moving around just outside the walls. I waited, barely breathing, straining to listen, but the noise faded, replaced by silence. I didn't sleep well, but by morning, the sound felt like a bad dream. The next day, I explored the nearby trails, taking in the crisp air and stunning views. But the unsettling feeling from the night before lingered, nagging at me. When I returned to the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. I was certain I'd locked it. I scanned the room, looking for anything out of place, but everything seemed exactly as I'd left it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. As evening fell, a thick fog rolled over the hills, blanketing the cabin and filling the windows with an eerie white haze. The air inside felt colder, heavier, as if something had seeped in with the fog. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that the isolation was just playing tricks on me. That night, I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, listening. And then, around midnight, the noises started again. This time, they were louder, unmistakable. It was a shuffling, moving slowly around the cabin, occasionally stopping near the windows, as if someone or something was circling the perimeter. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen. I wanted to look, to see if there was someone out there, but fear kept me rooted in place. The footsteps moved away, and I finally exhaled. I had almost convinced myself it was my imagination when the sound returned this time, louder and coming from the front door. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the cabin. Just one. And then silence. I gripped the covers, too afraid to move, to breathe, to acknowledge that I had heard anything at all. When morning came, I didn't leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for me to step outside. I tried to focus on anything else, but I kept catching glimpses of movement outside the window's shadows shifting in the fog, the faint outline of a figure that would vanish when I tried to focus on it. I told myself it was just the fog, just my mind playing tricks. But then I found the footprints. Just outside the cabin, circling around it in a perfect, endless loop, a trail of muddy prints too large to be my own, too defined to be a trick of the light. My heart raced as I traced their path, realizing they led straight to the front door, where they stopped, right at the threshold. By evening I felt trapped, unable to bring myself to stay another night, yet terrified of what waited outside. I locked the doors, the windows, checked every corner, but no amount of preparation could ease the dread that grew as the sky darkened. As night settled in, I turned off every light and sat in the dark, trying to stay still, quiet, hidden. Around midnight, the noises returned, louder, closer, circling the cabin with a dreadful, mocking patience. The footsteps moved closer and closer, as if whatever was out there knew I was alone, knew I was listening. And then the knock came again, soft, deliberate like a question. This time it was followed by another closer knock at the window, then at the back door. It was as if the presence were testing every door, every window, searching for a way in. I stayed rooted in place, heart pounding, praying for morning. Eventually, the noises stopped, leaving only silence, a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed down on me. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the room was filled with pale morning light. I wanted to believe it was over, but as I stepped outside, I froze. The footprints were still there, larger, messier, as if whatever had been outside had spent hours wandering, waiting, and on the door was a single muddy handprint, smeared like a signature. I packed my things in a daze, barely able to breathe, barely able to think, driven by the singular need to leave that place. As I pulled away, I looked back one last time and saw, through the fog, a figure standing in the tree line, a tall, dark silhouette that stayed perfectly still, watching me until I was out of sight. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the rental, searching for any information I could find. The previous owner, it turned out, had disappeared years ago, vanishing without a trace while staying at the cabin. Locals whispered about strange occurrences, tales of visitors hearing footsteps, seeing figures in the woods, and finding strange handprints left behind as if someone or something was still there, waiting. The reviews I'd read before booking, they had vanished, replaced by warnings, telling visitors to stay far away. I don't know who or what was out there with me that weekend, but whatever it was, it's still waiting, lingering in those fog-drenched woods, pacing in circles around the cabin, watching for the next visitor brave or foolish enough to step inside.